Welcome to the EpicureanFriends.com book review of A Few Days in Athens, a story about Epicurus and Epicurean philosophy. Please keep in mind that A Few Days in Athens is fictional, and the author is giving you her own interpretation of Epicurus. In a few cases, she deviates from Epicurus's own views fairly dramatically, but when we get to those, we'll point them out to you clearly. Even more, keep in mind that the participants you're about to hear are giving their own opinions. There are many different interpretations of Epicurus, and we hope this book review will prompt you to study Epicurus for yourself. For those who want to read more about Epicurus, the book we recommend the most is Norman DeWitt's Epicurus and His Philosophy. We also invite you to join us for discussion at the EpicureanFriends.com forum and to listen to our companion podcast, Lucretius Today, which is available at all major podcast sources. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll enjoy this session, so let's join it now. There's a couple things that came up since last week. Two of the themes that have always interested me most in studying Epicurus have been this issue of whether pleasure means just you're going to pursue nothingness and absence of pain, that's all you really want. And then the other issue is just sort of a general issue of passivity and how active and engaged are you going to be in the world. There seems to be some debate on both of those points about what Epicurus is really teaching. And last week, we ended the discussion by talking about the argument between Epicurus and Metrodorus and the anger that was involved there. And Scott was in particularly pointing that out about the potential or apparent contradiction in the way Epicurus was conducting himself. He was getting mad at Metrodorus for advocating getting mad. There was kind of a weird contradiction. What I found last week that I posted about and would call people's attention to, especially if they're listening to this as a podcast later on, there's a book out there on the remnants that are left of Philodemus's own anger. And there's not an awful lot left, but there's some interesting material in it that talks about that Philodemus, at least his opinion, is that there's a natural kind of anger that he says that Epicurus actually endorsed. And then there's an unnatural kind, which I think would be more equivalent to rage, which he says Epicurus did not endorse. And this book by, I think one of the names of the authors is Armstrong and the other one is McCorker or something like that. And there's a lot of commentary back and forth in which they disagree with some other authorities on Epicurus about how to interpret some of this material. But there are a couple of relatively clear fragments that they're able to use in support of their position. And one of them is a fairly decently preserved quote that says from Philodemus that, okay, here it is. Their position is this: thus, the sage is in a position to know better than anyone whether punishment of the wrongdoer is possible and appropriate. And possible and appropriate are the things that he's supposed to weigh in deciding whether to get angry and whether to carry out some retribution or not. And then they continue. If it is, then he, the sage, will inflict it to deter further offenses. Okay, he's saying that the sage will punish the adversary and will check and rein him in. And the sage would be insane not to grit his teeth and come back at him in one way or another. And then their conclusion is that if the sage cannot carry out the punishment for whatever reason, the sage simply avoids the wrongdoer in the future. I'm really just calling that to the attention of somebody who might be listening in, who wanted to investigate that issue of anger more carefully, that there is some preserved material in Philodemus about anger that would be relevant to understanding what the actual position might be. Now, of course, Frances Wright may not have had access to that. She certainly wouldn't have access to this particular book, which was only published in like 2018. I don't know whether any of these fragments were available in her age or not, but I tend to think that they probably were not. So there is a distinction apparently within commentators who may know what they're talking about, maybe, who say that there's a natural and an unnatural type of anger that Epicurus talked about, and that would be different from the Stoics, who would take the position that you would never give in to any kind of emotion like anger at all. Okay, that's one of the things I wanted to raise just for somebody who was interested in following up. And the other thing I wanted to raise was on this issue of taking action also. And I think I made a comment that we're going to come to a chapter in the future before we finish the book here where Epicurus actually takes action to save somebody from a stream. And that's going to be a cue for Joshua to tell a story in a minute that we talked about this morning. But I mentioned that Ellie had done a graphic and I went and found that graphic. And her graphic was based on some of Seneca's letters. Apparently it's book 1, letter 22 of his letters to his friends, I think it is. And apparently this is the quote from Seneca's letter. He says, read the letter of Epicurus, which appears on this matter. It is addressed to Idomeneus. The writer asks him to hasten as fast as he can and beat a retreat before some stronger influence comes between and takes from him the liberty to withdraw. But he also adds that one should attempt nothing except at the time when it can be attempted suitably and seasonably. Then, when the long sought occasion comes, let him be up and doing. And continuing the quote here, Seneca says, Epicurus forbids us to doze when we are meditating escape. He bids us hope for a safe release from even the harshest trials, provided that we are not in too great a hurry before the time, nor too dilatory when the time arrives. Okay, and of course, that's just an isolated fragment that's sitting out there in the middle of space, and everybody has to put a context on that and decide what it means. But I suspect that that fragment, which would be in Seneca, and which Frances Wright would certainly have had available to her, since Seneca's works, I think, were never lost. I don't think there's a problem with that. Maybe that's where this episode comes from later on, where he rescues Hedea. Okay, so those are just two things that I wanted to put out there for anybody interested in following up on those things. And when I was talking about that this morning with Joshua, the connection between these two discussions would be that William Short is the person to whom Thomas Jefferson wrote his letter in which Jefferson says, I too am an Epicurean. And he gives Short an outline of Epicurean philosophy and urges Short not to be too lazy in coming to see him, because laziness is not something that Epicurus would have endorsed. I've always presumed that William Short was just some kind of local farmer, but Joshua tells me that there's more to the William Short story than meets the eye, and that it connects to Frances Wright. So, Joshua.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So on October 5th of 2020, which is longer ago than I thought this came up, I wrote a thread on the forum called, rather presumptuously, The Long Neglect of William Short. And let me just read a little part of what I wrote here. So what I wrote was, judging from Mr. Jefferson's letter in reply, we may infer that William Short, like Jefferson, positively identified himself as an Epicurean. Cassius's recent reading of Frances Wright's other work. This was during that time when you were kind of looking into her non-Epicurean writings to hunt for clues, as it were. And so I was kind of interested myself. And what I've written here is, he was a talented, capable, brilliant protege of Thomas Jefferson and a deft hand at diplomacy. He forsook the dream of a high and polished political career in his pursuit of the love of a married French noblewoman. Despite his career disappointments, he was an accomplished businessman and retired wealthy, while Jefferson himself slipped into debt and penury at the end of his life. He was George Washington's first appointment to public office. He loved the new American project, but preferred living in Europe. And there's an anecdote that goes along with this. One day, while canoeing on the Seine with Rosalie, or however that might be pronounced, the married French noblewoman, whose much older husband, in a marriage of convenience, didn't object to the affair. He was actually rather blase about it. William noticed a boy on the verge of drowning. He dove into the waves to save the boy and nearly lost consciousness in the rescue. When the party returned to the nobleman's chateau, he was treated to a banquet and lauded as a hero. I've written here, it's probably a coincidence, but the story bears remarkable similarities to Theon's rescue of Hedea in A Few Days in Athens.
Or Epicurus's rescue, right?
Right. Well, yeah, Theon starts it and then Epicurus sort of finishes it because Theon does lose consciousness. That's the connection. That event happened in 1790 and Wright published her book in 1822. But the interesting thing is that William Short and Frances Wright and Thomas Jefferson sort of traveled in the same intellectual milieu in Europe. You know, the milieu of, in part, French Revolution figures heavily, particularly in Thomas Jefferson's writings. So there's a French connection there, but they were all involved with, I think, Jeremy Bentham and that school of philosophy. And so I'm not sure that they ever met, and I never really pursued that line of inquiry, but it's not unlikely to me that she would have heard this story, which would have circulated in this circle of friends that they had spread across two continents. So I think there might have been something there. There might be a connection between what happened in that little incident and what we're about to read about in this book. But I think it bears on the question of what you're talking about, which is being vigorously active when the time and situation calls for it.
And again, maybe this is just a testimony to how much somebody can achieve at a young age when they're not surrounded by the junk of television and modern society. And maybe you can do this on your own at 20 years old if you really put your mind to it. But I just have to believe these people she was associated with, almost a collaborative effort or something. There's so much in this book that I find so perceptive and detailed that it's hard for me to believe that someone who's 20 years older could write something like this without more of a life's experience. But at any rate, I've beat that horse dead enough. And I don't mean any slight to Frances Wright. It's just compelling to me that there's so much insight and we'll talk about it in chapter 9 here. This chapter 9 is going to contain another one of these long statements by Epicurus that strikes me as extremely perceptive about knowledge and a great way of interpreting Epicurean philosophy. But anyway, okay, let's go back to a normal presentation of the way we would do things. Chapter 9 is a discussion between Metrodorus, Leontium, Theon, and then Epicurus comes in at the end. Metrodorus and Leontium start out discussing that Epicurus values the arts as tools employed by true philosophy for happy living. And they get into the discussion that you sometimes hear people make that Epicurus ran from culture and he didn't like poetry. He said you wouldn't compose poetry, and that he was sort of, in a sense, anti-art and anti-intellectual, which is illustrated by the story of Polyaenus, who was a famous geometrician who, according to the argument in the ancient text, sort of gave that up at Epicurus's request or Epicurus's influence. And the argument being that here was this brilliant person who gives up his life's work and becomes basically a lackadaisical pleasure seeker instead of doing something worthwhile like studying geometry. And her response to that is, the way it's written, it's kind of interesting. I guess this is Frances Wright admitting that she's speculating as to the situation, but she says that I don't understand that that's the case. But what I do understand is that Epicurus told Polyaenus, like everybody else, that intelligent living means studying the art of happiness. And if you spend all of your time devoted to any subject, geometry or any other subject, then by definition, you're not going to broaden your experience and your knowledge well enough to be wise and understand that it is happiness that you're really after, and not being an expert at geometry or anything else, or any other virtue for that matter. And so they then turn, Metrodorus says that Epicurus rules his garden by example and persuasion rather than by authority. And then the latter part, which I think is another beautifully written passage, which reminds me another thing I was going to say. Joshua, I don't know how we're going to get this done, but at some point we've got to have a audible version of this book. Of course, I point my finger in your direction because you're the best voice that we've got. But this passage again here at the end of this chapter is beautiful, in addition to being insightful. But in that closing section, Epicurus discusses knowledge and what it can do to assist us in happy living. So I know that there's going to be some significant parts here we're going to want to talk about that I know, Joshua, you'll have good commentary on as well. But that would be the general framework of what we're going to be discussing in chapter 9. So, Joshua, a particular part you'd like to pick up first?
I think that this issue of culture and the advice that Epicurus gave, I think more or less without context. Was that in the letter to Pythocles or something? He says, hoist your sail and sail away.
I don't think it survives in context. I think it is a random fragment.
Okay, I think you might be right about that. But at any rate, the quote is attributed. I think it's something that's probably worth talking about because, as you say, there is a lot of confusion on this point. And I think we've talked a little bit about what culture means in the context of Epicurus, his philosophy, and the time and place that he was living in. But it's certainly something that's going to be very difficult to learn.
You can interpret it as an anti-intellectual position, or you can interpret it from a position that Epicurus was in disagreement with the sort of political civic education that Plato and Aristotle and most of the other Athenians were teaching the young people of Athens. And he was teaching them instead not to live for the state, but to live for a proper goal, which would be happiness or pleasure. And so if you're being indoctrinated in the day-to-day schooling in an erroneous method of learning, then it would be natural that Epicurus would say, run away from that learning. Just like today, we would suggest you run away from different types of schooling or education.
So here's what's I did find that quote, and it is referenced in Diogenes Laertius, and it's referenced in the long list of things that are attributed to Epicurus, which he finally, at the very end, he says, but the people who say these things are stark mad. And it's not clear to me whether he said it or if it's just attributed to him or if it's just wildly misunderstood. But it's sandwiched between, for example, he corresponded with many courtesans and especially Leontian. Epictetus calls him preacher of effeminacy and showers abuse on him. Then there's a story about Timocrates. And then at the end of all this, he says, but these people are stark mad. They haven't, in some way, they seem to be sure they haven't.
In that sequence with Diogenes Laertius, does it say set sail?
I don't know what translation I'm reading here, but yeah, it says, and it attributes it to the letter to Pythocles, so I don't or not, but it says hoist all sail.
Okay.
And steer clear of all culture.
I'm pretty sure that that's not in the letter to Pythocles that's preserved in the main text. So maybe there's a second letter to Pythocles is what he's referring to, but that's not in the main astronomical. All right, Joshua, where are we going next? Did any of you guys understand what was exactly going on at the very beginning of this book? There's something about people talking to Leontium, and it involves this Boidion as well. What's Boidion doing here? I'm kind of gathering this Boidion may be the girl that Theon is really kind of taken with, as opposed to Leontium.
Boidion is a very young girl. I guess I don't know how young. She's portrayed as being very timid, whereas the girl that becomes enamored with Hedea, who is not here right now.
Well, that's what I'm not clear about, because I was thinking that he actually might have been enamored with the handmaid of Hedea, and maybe I'll stand corrected on that because I haven't read this in a while. But I don't remember how this advances the plot. Music being restored to Athens. Now, that's something else that was specific that I'm not familiar with. What is the curse of Alcibiades? Kevin, I guess that's in your department. You got any idea what the curse of Alcibiades would be?
All I know is actually a footnote in my version of this, that his family, their sort of family instrument was this flute. And when they picked up as a family a bad reputation for attacking enemy soldiers under a flag of truce, that the curse that was supposed to have come down on them for that action, that the flute became a symbol of that. Is that? Yeah, what I've got in the footnote is that Alcibiades was a member of the, I don't know how to pronounce the name, Alcimoniads, a powerful Athenian family thought to be cursed when they stabbed an enemy on a flag of truce. And I would not have been able to make sense of that passage without the footnote. Usually Alcibiades is just thought to be a bad character for having sided with the Spartans. I didn't know the rest of the story about his family.
Well, I have a passage here from Plutarch's Parallel Lives, if you'd like to hear it. And this, as I said, this comes from Plutarch's Parallel Lives, which I don't know. Typically in Plutarch, you get different parallel lives, so people are compared to one another, and you might have, a good leader next to a bad leader and that kind of thing. So I don't know where this falls in that kind of. But here's the paragraph. At school, he, Alcibiades, usually paid due heed to his teachers, but he refused to play the flute, holding it to be an ignoble and illiberal thing. The use of the plectrum and the lyre, he argued, wrought no havoc with the bearing and appearance which were becoming to a gentleman. But let a man go to blowing a flute, and even his own kinsmen scarcely reck. Moreover, the lyre blended its tones with the voice of its master, whereas the flute closed and barricaded the mouth, robbing its master both of voice. Flutes, then, said he, for the sons of they know not how to converse. But we Athenians, as our fathers, have Athena for foundress and Apollo for patron, one of whom cast the flute away in disgust, and the other flayed the presumptuous flute player. Thus, half in jest and half in earnest, Alcibiades emancipated himself and the rest of the boys as well. For word soon made its way to them that Alcibiades loathed the art of flute, scoffed at its disciple, and rightly too. Wherefore the flute was dropped entirely from the program of a liberal education, was altogether despised.
Well,
wow,
interesting.
I'm gonna throw my flute away too. Jesus.
Yeah. If only they knew that before they gave all my children recorders.
How well do you think that would work in at your school, Kevin? Do you think a student saying this is a horrible discipline and it's
It's
disgraceful, so I don't need to learn it, and then nobody else needs to learn it either?
I hope it wouldn't go over too well.
Right? Yeah.
But that is strange.
It is strange. And of course, I have no idea what reference he's making here to Athena and Apollo, and casting the flute away and flaying the presumptuous flute player. I have no idea what that.
Neither do I, actually.
Well, so that's an interesting tidbit
Yeah.
from Greek history that we now know about. But can we swing this back to where we were, and how does this play into what we think about what's going on back in the
Yeah, that
story?
just
I
makes
don't know.
the first bit of this chapter even weirder.
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah. It does seem to present a bit of a countercultural to the garden as opposed to the rest of the city, which Leontia makes explicit. She said this has not been restored to Athens. It's simply allowed here in the garden, kind of a place apart. So I guess that's the thrust. Why that it is very strange.
I think we've already covered basically the issue that the wise man is going to pursue a broader understanding of human happiness and not stick entirely to one subject, which is the point about Polyaenus. And then Metrodorus makes some comments about how Epicurus leads by example and not by giving orders, and talks about candor again, Scott, there, a prominent feature of his mind. Is what Metrodorus says. And then Epicurus walks in and gives this last statement about accepting praise. And then he goes on to discuss knowledge. Without knowledge, he's a brute. With knowledge, he's a god. But like happiness, he pursues it without finding it or obtains of it, but an imperfect glimpse. And then he goes on to basically a discussion of how book learning doesn't really help anybody if they can't apply it, that books don't give understanding. Knowledge of the world is not knowledge of man. The only thing that's real in terms of knowledge is that which goes to make us better and happier men, and which fits us to assist the virtue and happiness of others. And that the most perfect knowledge is to how to govern ourselves. And then unless you have that knowledge of being able to understand your own self and your own actions and your own goals, then you really don't have any kind of knowledge really at all. So I guess, again, he's putting it in context with all the other specific scientific knowledge, which can be helpful, but can't take the place of a knowledge of human nature, human life, and what the goal of life is really about.
Right. And there's a parallel passage in Philodemus where he's talking about the Epicurean community of his day in perhaps in the Bay of Naples. And what he has to say is that the Epicurean community of his time were, and I can't remember exactly how he phrases it, he says they're shameless in their disregard of the books. They talk about Epicurean philosophy and they pretend to be Epicurean, but they don't do the hard work of actually reading the Epicurean texts for themselves and trying to parse, understand them, apply them to their own lives. And the image that he uses to drive that point home, he said, everything they know, they learn from summary, as if someone could learn how to navigate a ship just by reading a book about it. If you want to learn how to navigate a ship, you have to actually step on the deck of a ship, would be a good start.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an element of that here, I think, which is that kind of what you've just been saying, that useless knowledge, and I'm sure we all have our own share of that, while interesting, does not really help us to settle the main business, which is the business of living and the business of living well.
Mm-hmm. This grabs me in a way. Let me throw something out here because I don't know if I'm off base or something, but it's been something I've been pondering about with regard to Epicureanism for some time. And that is that I almost feel that in some sense, regardless of how strongly we have in the writings that Epicurus says sort of the be all end all is pleasure, I think he had something more complicated in mind. And I think this section here is something that represents that a little bit. Pleasure by itself, in a sense, is exactly what the Stoics would criticize it. It's dangerous. If you only follow pleasure with no wisdom, with no knowledge, if you only just follow pleasure, you do become in danger of being an animal. You do become just in the moment. I'm going to eat this marshmallow right now instead of waiting 15 minutes for 5 marshmallows. That's the kind of idiot you become if you seek pleasure with no wisdom. Every time I hear Epicurus saying, and I think I hear it here in this last part of this chapter, that if you don't really learn how to live, if you don't learn how to couple wisdom with your passions, then you're a fool. You're not going to go anywhere. You're not going to accomplish what I'm talking about. I feel that anyway from this, and that's something I've been thinking about. I don't know anywhere. Well, actually, I do know places where Epicurus specifically states that passion or pleasure, without any access to knowledge whatsoever, flounders. It isn't where we really want to go. We have to couple these two things together.
That would make sense. There's a weird bit that I didn't quite understand why there's a reference to the Serenades and the Cynics right after Leontium says that she's going to talk about the master's advice regarding pursuit of sciences, liberal arts. But that notion that there's too little or too much, that the study, either pursuit of just pleasure without wisdom, the Serenades, or giving up the knowledge of everything that you could get from culture and civilization, the Cynic route, are both wrong, right? What you were just saying, Scott, about the pursuit of pleasure without wisdom or knowledge is self-destruction, right? So many things, might be physically pleasurable, but you don't know what they're going to do to you. And the Cynic route of denying all sort of human culture and learning is much too austere. What I kept waiting for here was some notion of Theon chiming in, or some of the other younger people in the scene chiming in with some kind of pursuit of geometry or mathematics, or the kind of knowledge that allows you to be a bit of a playground bully, instead of the knowledge about how to live your life that supposedly comes with age and wisdom. That's what I kept expecting, but I didn't see that contrast here.
Joshua, go ahead.
Well, I think they both raise fair points here. One thing I'm not sure we do enough of to draw a distinction between pleasure as a feeling that is internal, pleasure as a stimulus that is external. And so while I think Epicurus, I'm not sure he makes necessarily, although there is that active versus passive and all that, but there is a sense in which while pleasure as an internal feeling, which only has one alternative in Epicurus's view, there's no middle state between the alternative to pleasure, which is pain. And so in that context, pleasure as a feeling is not just superior, it is the good, and pain to be avoided. And I think that drawing a distinction between pleasure as a feeling and pleasure as a stimulus, or whatever it is outside that stimulates the feeling of pleasure, while the feeling is always good, no matter where it comes from, not every source of the stimulus is necessarily good. And this leads into what I think we have to talk about. The variously has been called the hedonic calculus, or Epicurean calculus, or the pleasure pain calculus. And so I don't know if that's helpful, particularly to Scott. I don't know if that's a helpful lens.
Well, I have a question about it, Joshua.
Yeah.
I mean, I question the concept of an external pleasure in a way. I mean, it might be that I have honey and it tastes sweet to me. And so that might be an external pleasure. And the feeling that I get then is the pleasure I have inside. But another person might take in honey and that is not pleasurable. And the same can be true of any external stimulus. Seems crazy, but it really can be true that a particular external anything can be perceived of, depending on what my background and history and my physical senses and so forth do with that external stimulus. So there's not such a thing in a way as an external pleasure. Pleasure is always just what I feel when I encounter a stimulus, what I do with that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think I probably expressed it badly. I'm talking here about the difference in stimulus, which you're right to say could be pleasurable or not. Because of course, to the masochist, pain is pleasure.
Yeah, sure.
So
Yeah.
that's
Right.
a difficulty. But I think that to talk about pleasure being the good, it doesn't necessarily mean that every source of pleasure is good. And this, I think, touches on what you talk about when you talk about the need to combine the pursuit of pleasure with wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Because
yeah, I feel
it takes wisdom. Yeah, because it takes wisdom to determine which external stimuli to get pleasure.
And in fact, that's one of the reasons I think from the beginning, although I love Epicureanism, I have also struggled with it, because pleasure seems too simple a thing to make the greatest good. It just seems misleading somehow and too easy to be criticized. Maybe the word itself, and you never can, you could probably have arguments with philosophers forever right now on what pleasure actually is, or with psychologists. But now take that through thousands of years and 3 different languages, how much harder is it to say what is pleasure and what, this is a tricky thing to pin down. But I've definitely felt that the word pleasure, as it's given to us in the English language, I worry about whether that really captures what is being driven at.
Well, what I what I have to say to that is, if pleasure is a tricky thing to pin down, then wisdom is a very tricky thing to pin
Sure.
down. But
Yes.
but I think you're right to point out these are difficult problems and worth looking at.
Let me go ahead and comment on Scott and Kevin's points for just a moment. Starting with Scott's point, I believe that and would contend that you can go back into the letter to Menicius, you can go into the principal doctrines, and you can see time after time and place after place where Epicurus is stressing that prudence or practical wisdom is absolutely essential to the proper life. He clearly says that in the letter to Menicius that sometimes we're going to choose pain instead of pleasure for the overall goal in the end of greater pleasure or less pain. But there are many instances where I think somebody can defend Epicurus that he's being very clear that you need to reason these things out. And if you don't reason them out, then you're going to be led into disaster. That's what Torquatus says when he says that in the very sort of opening of his narrative, he starts talking about how nobody likes or praises pain in and of itself or condemns pleasure of itself. But some people condemn pleasure because they don't understand how to pursue it properly, and they end up in terrible consequences because of it. So in response to that point of Scott's, I would say that there's a lot of text that can be lined up to support the position and answer Scott's question that Epicurus is telling you that you must have wisdom and prudence in addition to pleasure. Now, the rub comes, I think, when you go further and start talking about what does wisdom identify as really the end goal of life. It's not wisdom in and of itself. And if you're going to isolate a single thing as the goal of life, it's not wisdom for the sake of itself or any virtue for its own sake. It's only pleasure in a very broad, abstract sense that is good in and of itself, and which we immediately perceptually find to be desirable. So that I would try to combine the answer to Scott and say that the two obviously go hand in hand, but that when you use proper wisdom to look at the nature of the universe and decide what nature really has going on here, that if you insist on identifying a single goal as the appropriate goal, it is this feeling of pleasure that is the destination to which you're going. But you're never going to make that destination. You're never going to achieve it properly all the way along unless you use wisdom and reason. Again, there's one of the principal doctrines that the wise man is always going to guide his life by reason. So that would be what I would say to Scott there. And then when Kevin, yeah, I agree with you. That's an interesting part of this when she's talking about that the Serenades who are after life's basically immediate pleasure and so forth, they criticize Epicurus for not going after pleasure strongly enough. They say that he holds back and that he's basically a weakling because he doesn't understand that the immediate pleasures of life are all that's really there to be pursued. So I gather what she's saying is that the disciples of nothing but pleasure, the Serenades, say that Epicurus did not pursue it aggressively enough. And on the contrary, the Cynics, or obviously the Stoics, would say that he pursued pleasure too much because they don't want to pursue pleasure at all. So her observation here, and I never like arguing about the middle ground because I don't really think that Epicurus was really ever going after the middle as much as he was attempting to identify the right amount of everything. But I interpreted that section to mean that it's ironic and cancels itself out that certain people accuse Epicurus of pursuing pleasure too much, while another set of people accuses him of pursuing pleasure too little, which might be an indication that maybe he's about right. I kind of was thinking that was the argument that she was making there, if he was being attacked from both sides. So,
and then maybe to stretch that a bit, and this might be a stretch, the Serenades and the Cynics both come off as simply unwise everywhere else they go up, right? The Stoics don't get mentioned here, right? It's the two schools that are unwise in the one case, over embrace of physical pleasure, and in the other, their complete denial of anything that civilization has to offer.
You know, it's funny.
Maybe this is a larger point about wisdom.
I think so, 100%. In fact, it's really funny because as you were talking, Cassius, what was happening with me was I realized that, I recognize those passages you're talking about where Epicurus was bringing pleasure and wisdom together, and they have to work together and so forth. I recognize those passages, but why did I have that feeling? It was because of Cassius. I realized that you were having a real strong stance that was making me feel like you were divorcing wisdom from, the ultimate good was pleasure, ultimate good, everything. At the end of the day, that's the ultimate good. That's where I kept having problems. And you kept, that was, I don't mean to criticize you, but that was a song you kept singing, And
right.
I felt like, no, that cannot be, because you can't make it the summum bonum. You can't make it the final good, because if it's then it is divorced. Whenever you try to separate these two things from each other, you run into trouble.
Right.
And I don't know. And in some ways, Epicurus does say they are together. They have to be together, or it doesn't work.
Yeah, Scott. And part of my response to you there was that I'm no longer comfortable myself. We've had this discussion already too about this whole issue of a summum bonum. I'm just not clear that I like the idea or that even Epicurus really, really embraced the idea that there is a single goal for everybody at every moment. When I come down to saying that pleasure is the goal, I see that in my own mind as an extremely abstract argument that doesn't really do justice to the full philosophy, and that if you just look at it superficially is going to be as unrepresentative of what he's really saying as it is to sort of, the Stoics would deny that what we consider to be Stoic in a bad way today is representative of what they taught. It's like everybody's always accusing everybody of misunderstanding them. And so I guess we just have to all live with that nobody seems to understand anybody else. But I do agree with you that a superficial statement of pleasure is the goal of life is not particularly helpful. And I really don't even know that I think that Epicurus taught it that way.
That's what I wonder.
I think when he was forced, if he was in a logical debate and he had to decide, that we talked about flags before, I'm thinking that if he decided that he had to have a flag at a particular moment, that his flag was going to be pleasure. But that a flag is extremely superficial and doesn't give you the motivation. But
I agree with you 100%. Yeah, he got forced into it, it seemed like.
Well,
you had to have one.
You had to have one, but it's useful at times as well. So that's maybe that's your issue again of wisdom and the feeling of pleasure have to go together. Is you're constantly going back and forth from different levels of perspective, and if you need the abstract logical perspective of a single goal of life to contrast to virtue or to contrast to piety, if you're into religion, then the feeling of pleasure probably does provide a single description of what it is you're talking about. But at that level, you've just got to be very, very careful that you understand what it means.
Yeah, I can't even quite go there, but that's just me.
I know.
Epicurus did.
I wonder if maybe Kevin can be of more help here, but I wonder to what extent this is an artifact of Greek philosophy in general. Because when I read, in my very limited reading of the dialogues of Plato, there is an obsession for coming up with the one answer. That's going to trump all the other. And so I'd be curious to hear what Kevin has to say about that, having read.
My thoughts are half formed. I keep starting to I rather than pleasure as a highest good, a summum bonum, the way Cassius was objecting to, it seems more to me like Epicurus uses pleasure as the reason anything else might be good. Right? Why is virtue good? Because it brings pleasure. Why is wisdom good? Because it brings pleasure. Not that there's this thing, pleasure, that is the one thing we're aiming at. It's what makes everything else good, because it brings us pleasure, and then pleasure of a fairly sophisticated kind, not just the physical pleasure, which is important for some things, but this is where I'm starting to struggle, like a more human pleasure, right?
But watch out. Cassius is going to jump on you if you start saying things like flourishing or living well.
Then I'm trying not to, because clearly that's not quite it either, right? But
well, I don't know.
I was thinking earlier that Epicurus might say practical wisdom, what makes it wisdom is that it gets you pleasure. What makes something virtuous is that it gets you pleasure. And then pleasure is, it's almost you've got to experience it to know it. And until then, he can sort of talk you in the right direction. But unless you've got it, you don't know what it is.
I still think pleasure is problematic, though. I mean, it's not just about pleasure. It's about living well. It's about feeling positive, which is different than pleasure.
Why is that different? Why do you feel that's different from pleasure?
Here's an example. Here's a mental exercise. Okay, let's go to the Matrix. Has everybody seen the Matrix?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, think of the bad guy who turns in Matrix 1. I don't even remember his name, but he's making a deal with the agents that, he's going to live the life in the Matrix, and he's going to have this gorgeous babes all around. He's going to have all the food he wants. He's going to have wealth. He's going to live an incredibly long life. Everything's going to be perfect and wonderful for him. And they promise him that if he'll betray his friends. Okay, well, he is making a very wise decision on what's going to maximize his pleasure, on what's going to maximize the pleasure that he gets from the rest of his life by betraying his friends. Now, it's just like,
wait, did you just say that he thought it was rational for him to take the position that betraying his friends was going to lead to the greatest pleasure for the rest of his life?
Yes.
Now, Scott, so the betrayal of your friends is going to, I don't know that I want to be your friend, Scott, anymore.
You also left out a key part. Part of the deal is all memory of the betrayal is erased.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yes.
Okay,
that's important. Make it easier.
that makes all the difference.
What was the black character's name again with the glasses?
Morpheus.
Morpheus, yeah. And remember that Morpheus, when he told him he could take one of these two pills, he said, "I'm not promising you this is going to be good. It's just all I've got to offer here is the truth." I think that's an important challenge and question. Is all we really want to be happy? I mean, I know that's a crazy question here in an Epicurean group, but in a way, I'm kind of throwing it out as serious, not a trivial question.
I wonder if a very strong Epicurean might just say yes, that the truth itself is only good if it leads to happiness. Otherwise, there are, truths that if they're going to overall make us miserable and not lead to harm, why no?
Mm-hmm. I think Epicurus would say that the truth is going to be your strongest tool for the achievement of happiness. And he's not going to admit that there's necessarily a contradiction between those two goals. His view of nature, he's concluded, I think, is so strongly in favor of pleasure being what nature has established that I don't think he's going to admit that there's a real possibility that the truth is going to lead you in a different direction.
Is that naive?
Well, it could be in particular situations, it probably is. I mean, we aren't guaranteed success in finding happiness in life. I think that's pretty clear. But there's maybe it's what you said a moment ago, Kevin, that if you thought that you were accepting something less than the truth as the basis on which you're living your life, that thought itself might be so painful to you, like betraying your friends, that you might not be able to live with yourself.
Maybe.
I think that's a highly individual situation for sure. I wouldn't suggest that everybody has to follow that same position, but I just kind of sense it in Epicurus's character. And I think maybe it's one of these threads of Western civilization. Maybe this is Western and everybody doesn't think the same way. All humans don't think this. But there seems to be in certain people this devotion to, I want to know the truth above all else. It sounds kind of hubristic for me to say it about myself. I think I would take that position. It's kind of like one of these things that kind of like when you give your life for your friend, you're doing it with the knowledge that if you could have saved them but did not, the rest of your life would be ruined. I have a feeling that admitting to myself that I was living a lie would be the kind of thing that would ruin your life so badly that you wouldn't want to do it. Or at least some people would want to anyway.
I was just going to question that till you said the last part, right? Because I think some of the distinction, even in this chapter of Frances Wright, about pursuing sort of esoteric knowledge as opposed to knowledge that helps you live well. But the way you just put it, knowing the truth about what you're pursuing or living a lie is a little different than devoting I have a PhD in 11th century logic. It's not going to help me live better, but it's fascinating in and of itself, right? And I think the truth of that, whatever it might not be something Epicurus thought was useful, but the kind of truth you were talking about, I think is.
Yeah. It clearly has to come down to some central issue of the way you're living your life. Obviously, I don't really care to know the truth about 11th century logic either. And clearly that's the
turns out no one ever does.
There are so many things in life that don't seem to lead to practical results. And I pretty clearly, that's one of the key points here is that knowledge for the sake of knowledge. In fact, is there anybody, even though, I mean, Scott, you wouldn't argue that knowledge for the sake of knowledge itself makes sense to you as the goal of life, does it?
Absolutely not. In fact, it hardly doesn't make sense for any reason.
Right.
Yeah.
No. I have to say this before we go any further. Scott, another thing I like about you, I love clocks. And I'm seeing those clocks on the wall behind you, and I see you have a whole collection of them. There's nothing I like more than listening to ticking mechanical clocks.
Oh my God, yeah, I've been watching that too. And does each one of them tell a different
I
time?
forgot I was sitting here. I wasn't looking at I got these crazy things. But you see, actually, none of these clocks works.
Okay.
And so actually each one of them, however, is correct twice a day, and they're all set at different times. So basically, if you can get the right time, but you just have to figure out how to use them.
I kind of think there seems to be a thread of people who like really the whole issue of time and clocks and so forth. For some reason, they kind of go together with philosophy.
Yeah, so it goes along with craziness. But anyway,
yeah,
I forgot about that. I forgot where I was and everything. I was looking at a different screen and reading stuff. No, I got this video on, and you're looking at the clocks.
I've been watching over your shoulder trying to guess which time zone you're in.
I didn't know what you were looking at. I might have been taking my notes. Yeah. Okay. Anyway.
All right, Joshua, bring us back to the subject at hand, can you? Yeah.
Oh, and what is the subject at hand? One thing that Scott said, which I know was sort of offhand and not the totality of his position, but when we talk about the goal being something like living well, when I think about that phrase, I tend to think that doesn't really answer the question, does it? That just invites another question. And so when we say that, maybe the goal of life is living well, the obvious question. The obvious question is what does it mean to live well? And I think this is where you get into the Greek philosophers and their obsession with finding the one answer, whether it's virtue or wisdom or pleasure. Maybe it need not be the case that there's only one answer to that question, but I don't know. I'd just be curious to hear more about that.
Well, let me just say
every time
this.
I go over this, I'm convinced there's not one answer, but there are bunches of different answers and different people find each one persuasive, right? There's one answer for different people. Does that make sense? Or each, given whatever the answer is, bunches of people are going to think it's correct and not be able to argue between them, right? And every so often I'm convinced by the Aristotelian flourishing, and every so often I'm convinced by the Stoic not being bothered by things, right? And part of me admires the people who can stick to an answer.
Anybody have anything that they want to say before we quit?
You record these and you're saving these for posterity, right, Cassius?
That is correct. And so
if people are actually listening to it, then we might want to leave off here with this great question that we haven't resolved. So they'll want to hear the next episode and find out what the answer is.
A cliffhanger.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea.
Oh dear.
Next week on A Few Days in Athens.
Right.
The answer to life, the universe, and everything.
Well, in the next chapter will move us along toward it. So why don't we can indeed leave it there unless somebody has something else they want to add for tonight.
All right, it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, very good. We'll do it next week. Thank you very much.
All right.
Good night, all.
Bye.